$42,133.53. That is the difference in GDP per capita between the United States and the European Union. It's equal to about one 2026 Ford F-150 STX, or about 3 iPhone 17 Pro Maxes every month, or about 350 Chicken McNuggets every single day of the year. In fact, the output gap is so large, it's bigger than the EU per capita output itself. The average American produces more than double what the average European does. It's almost taken as common knowledge at this point that the US is lapping Europe when it comes to innovation and productivity. For example, here's what US Ambassador Putzda has to say about the issue.
Do you think Europe is weak at this moment, sir?
Economically? Yeah, I think Europe's got real problems economically. If you look back 14 years ago, just 14 years, nominal GDP in Europe was ahead of the United States. Now, this year, the IMF says it'll be about 20% below. And if you include the UK, if you exclude the UK, you're looking at 30% below. And the industrial giant of Europe, Germany, has GDP per capita last year that was below that of the state of West Virginia. West Virginia is the 49th lowest state on GDP per capita. If you look at France, Spain, Italy, I'll throw the United Kingdom in just for balance, and the EU generally, GDP per capita is lower than the state of Mississippi, which is the 50th lowest US state. That just shouldn't be.
As an EU citizen, this greatly unsettles me. I don't want to be poor and stagnant. So naturally, I set out to find the most respectable looking YouTube videos and Twitter threads on the issue, and there's quite a lot of them, to see whether or not this wicked statistic can actually be trusted. But no matter how big the YouTuber or how decorated the economists, the arguments always felt incomplete to me. There was always something missing. And thus, here I am, making this video. But let's get back to the topic. Why does it even matter in the first place? In short, it basically comes down to policy. People often say that excessive regulation and super strict labor laws are to blame for Europe falling behind and stagnating over the last 10 to 20 years. And if it's truly down to policy, that means we can change it. So the topic is really hotly discussed by some of the best economists in the world. And just to be clear here, we don't only care about the current state of Europe as opposed to the US, but also what makes a country poor or rich in the long run. And that is its ability to transform inputs, so capital and labor, into outputs, and how this changes over time. We call this productivity and productivity growth. But to make a comparison, we need some quantity that we can measure. And you probably already heard of the standard unit that is always used for these. I've already used it in the intro. It's the nominal GDP per capita of a country. Essentially, nominal GDP per capita is the total value of everything that a country produces divided by the size of the population. So let's compare. I made a graph with the newest version of the Penn World Tables, which is a pretty famous dataset that is used for international comparison of economic output. So what we see in this graph is the nominal GDP per capita of the current 27 EU states compared to the US, and it's expressed in US dollars. This graph paints a really bleak picture. Not only has the US always been more productive than the EU, but the gap is widening a ton in recent years. And to make matters worse, this isn't just because the US seems to have had a spectacular decade. It's because the EU seems to have completely stopped growing. It's on the same level of GDP per capita in 2023 that it was in 2008. So that answers the question, right? The US is way more productive and every year Europe is falling further and further behind. Well, if that was the case, there would be no video. Because whenever this topic comes up, everyone and their mom come out of the woodwork and say, well, but what about X and what about Y? And so we're going to look at the most common of these what about topics and determine whether or not they actually hold any water. And the first one, and the most common one, is what about exchange rates and PPP? If we go back to our graph for a second, you see that in order to compare Europe and the US, I need to bring both of them to the same currency. And for this I'm using the US dollar. This may seem like a really natural thing to do, but I'm actually making quite a big assumption here. To see why, we first need to talk a bit about how exchange rates are actually determined. This isn't the video to go super in depth on this topic, but the gist of it is that the exchange rate is determined by the demand for your currency. And the demand for your currency is partly determined by how attractive your goods that you produce in your country are for everyone else to buy. These are called traded goods. So if, for example, the US is really productive at producing phones, for example, the iPhone, which everyone in the world will want to buy, they will want to hold a lot of dollars to buy these iPhones with, and thus the value of the dollar will go up. This leads to what is called the Balassa-Samuelson effect, or how Samuelson himself called it, the Ricardo Wiener Harrod Balassa Samuelson Penn Bagwadi effect. I don't know why this one didn't catch on. This effect basically states that economies which have a really productive export sector will see a corresponding inflation in their consumer prices for their non-exported or local goods and services. I know this can be quite complicated, so I want to give a really simple, concrete example of what I'm talking about here. There are some industries in which productivity simply isn't that different, doesn't matter which country you go to. One common example of this are haircuts. It doesn't really matter whether or not you get your haircut in Lisbon or in New York. They probably both take roughly the same amount of time and both look quite similar, but the one in Lisbon probably costs way less than the one in New York. You can probably find a decent haircut in Lisbon for 20 bucks, and I imagine in New York it's gonna be a multiple of that. Now, economically, this makes a lot of sense. After all, New York is a much more expensive place than Lisbon is. But when we're trying to compare GDP between two countries, this becomes a problem. Because ultimately, what we're trying to measure is your material quality of life. And if the same haircut would only add $20 to Portugal's GDP, but $100 to the US's GDP, then these measures become fundamentally incomparable. How big this distortion ends up being is dependent on what share of your consumption comes from domestic production versus international trade, but it can be very significant. Luckily, this issue has been known for a while, and economists have come up with some pretty clever adjustments. The most famous one, and the one we're gonna look at in this video, is called Purchasing Power Parity, or PPP for short, and it's essentially a cost of living adjustment that you can use to compare these production figures. The way this works is very similar to how inflation is measured within one country. Essentially, you look at a basket of goods that's supposed to represent the average consumer, and you see how the prices in there compare between the two countries. Essentially, if in both Portugal and the US people consume haircuts and buy phones, you will see that phones are relatively the same price between those two countries, but haircuts are much cheaper in Portugal. So Portugal will get a slight boost from PPP to account for the fact that cost of living is cheaper there. Obviously, PPP isn't perfect in all situations, but it's much closer to what we're actually trying to measure, which is the productive output of the US versus Europe. So let's look at what this adjustment actually does to our comparison. So here you can see the same graph as before. The only difference is that it's adjusted for purchasing power. And you might already notice it looks quite different. Small side note, the reason this graph is just overall much less steep than the one before is that PPP already adjusts for inflation. So we take into account that the same $100 would have bought you a lot more chicken nuggets in the year 2000 than they would in the year 2025. The other thing that you might notice is that the US-EU gap has shrunk massively. Whereas before, the US was producing roughly 200% of what the EU was producing, now this gap has shrunk to roughly 140%. This is still a massive difference, obviously, but nowhere near as crazy as it was before. And maybe much more importantly, the divergence that we've seen between the European Union and the United States in the last decade doesn't seem apparent here at all. Summarizing, better, but not great. There is more though. The next thing people usually say is, what about working time? Because here's another factor. We Europeans are lazy as hell. I'm just kidding, of course, but the whole Anglosphere does seem to have that Protestant work ethic. If we take a look at the graph of the average hours worked in the EU and the US, we can see that both of them are slowly trending downwards, but not only is the EU trending downwards a little bit faster, but it is also just at a much lower level to begin with. This highlights another problem with using GDP as our ultimate measurement here, and that is how much free time you have and how much you work is kind of a personal choice. If in the US, people just culturally tend to value consumption a bit higher, and people in the EU tend to value their free time a bit higher, then the EU gets penalized for that in their GDP measurement. We can't really say one is better than the other. It could be that in the EU we just have better things to do in our free time, but it could also just be that in the US they just have much cooler stuff to buy. Let's just accept these preferences for what they are and simply look at the numbers. What we're interested in here now is the PPP adjusted GDP per hour worked. It's a bit of a mouthful, but essentially it gives us the actual productivity. So how much output we produce for each hour worked. The reason we want to include the working hours in here is because if two people were to earn the same salary, but one does it with 20 hours of work a week and the other does it with 40, we would obviously say that the one who only works 20 hours a week is much better off than the person who works the full 40. These graphs are probably all starting to kind of look the same to you because the result is very much the same as the last time. Gap is smaller, but it's very much still there. Now the US is down from about a 40% advantage to about a 25% advantage. Unfortunately, unlike PPP, which is basically always the correct choice to use here, I'm not so convinced that adjusting for the hours worked is really fully correct and honest. Just to be clear, there is outstanding economists like Paul Krugman and Gabriel Zuckman who do make the argument that yes, Europe might get slightly lower productivity, but they do get a lot more free time and some other benefits. So in the end, it's really worth it, and the difference between the US and Europe is much smaller than we tend to think. The reason I don't think this argumentation paints the whole picture is that in Europe we have much higher taxes than in the US. And as we know, taxes are very distortive. So it's not clear whether Europeans really want to work less or whether or not we just work less because if we work more, so much more of it gets taken by the government. Of course, you could also take the other side of that argument and say US people don't really want to work this much. It's simply that the safety net and the labor market regulations are much more weak there, and thus there's much more pressure to perform financially. So the problem isn't one-sided, but it's the fact that we can't really tell either way. There's also another problem with using this measurement, and that is that it measures the average productivity over a labor hour. Why is this a problem? Well, it biases the measurement against the country that works more. And this is a bit complicated to understand, but essentially the idea is that there is diminishing marginal returns to everything you put into the production function. Intuitively, you can think of this like your own workday. In your first couple hours, you're probably a lot more awake and motivated than you are in the last hour just before going home. And since Americans work systematically more than Europeans, they have much more of these unmotivated, tired hours. And since these hours all factor into the average productivity calculation, it will introduce a downward bias to the measurement itself. In the end, all of this just leaves us with a massive question mark because the hours worked are probably quite important, but we don't really know how to properly incorporate them into this. Thankfully, there's a nice solution to this. It was originated by Nobel laureate Robert Solow, and it's called growth accounting. Don't worry, it's not actual accounting. It's a procedure used to measure the contribution of different factors to economic growth and, importantly, to indirectly compute the rate of technological progress. Intuitively, it could tell you how much a country would produce if it used its inputs efficiently. I noticed during editing that I don't actually go into what efficiency is. For the purpose of this video, just think of it as the company correctly allocating all their resources. So the secretary is on the PC and the manufacturing worker is on the factory floor and not the other way around. Essentially, there's no better configuration of your inputs that would increase your output. For relationships such as these, economists like to use what is called a production function. Now, if math's not your thing, don't worry, I'm gonna spare you the details. But I think it can really help to see what it looks like. On screen, you're seeing one of the simplest forms one of these production functions can take. Y here is simply our economic output. A stands for technology level or productivity. K stands for the capital stock. L stands for the amount of available labor. And F, the function that they're wrapped in, is literally just a stand-in that can describe any sort of relationship that these two factors have with each other. There's no reason to be specific here for now. If you've never worked with this before, this might be quite confusing, so let me give you a simple example. Let's say we have a shoe factory, and this shoe factory produces according to a really simple production function. The amount of shoes produced is equal to the technology level times the combined capital and labor. And this shoe factory has 2 workers and 2 machines and an overall technology level of 10. If we combine this, we will then see that the shoe factory will be able to produce 40 shoes a day. And you can kind of treat the amount of shoes produced per day as the GDP of this shoe factory. From this, it becomes pretty clear that if we want to increase our output, we either have to hire more workers, so increase L, or buy more machines, that will be increase K, or maybe we can buy better machines, or train our workers so that they become more efficient in working with the machines. That will be an increase in our production technology, so A. Obviously, in real life, no production function would look this simple, but in principle, this is how they work. But what do we gain from this now? Well, it turns out countries measure and track their capital stock and their labor. And so we can actually, using a formula such as this, get an estimate for the productivity. And not just productivity, you can actually get much more than that if you're willing to use a bit more complex of a production function. But before we go into that, let's first look at how the euro area TFP actually stacks up against the US. I've taken this graph from a working paper on the subject by Anthony Burgo that goes into much more detail on the subject. It also uses data that goes back much further than the source I was using. I will put a link in the description. From this graph, we can see that the euro area productivity was roughly on par with the US before the wars, then it took a massive hit from the two world wars before rapidly recovering right up until the 1990s or 2000s. After this, there's been a pretty noticeable decline though, and this is exactly what gets people so worried about the topic. However, what's really cool about this paper is that the author doesn't just look at the total factor productivity, but he actually looks at the entire output gap between the euro area and the US and decomposes it into its different contributions. And here we're looking at the result of that. And I know this graph isn't exactly straightforward to read, but essentially you can think of the parts that are above the 0 point of the y-axis as things in which the EU has an advantage, and at the stuff that is below the 0 point, things that the US has an advantage. What's interesting to us here is mostly everything that's post-World War II. You can see there, right after World War II, the US had a massive advantage in both productivity and capital. Those are the dark blue and yellow bars respectively. And this makes sense because Europe was essentially bombed back to the Stone Age. But Europe still had an advantage in the employment rate and also the working hours, which are the red and the green bar here. But over time, as Europe caught back up to the US in terms of productivity and capital, the employment rate and the average working time kind of began reversing. This reversal also explains why, even though Europe came really close to closing the productivity gap, it never quite managed to close the GDP gap, because at that point the employment rate and the average working time were already quite a bit higher in the US. You can also see that the fall in productivity and average working time after the 2000s has been kind of hidden by a bit of an increase in the employment rate in Europe. I think this graph summarizes the issue really nicely because it shows that the gap between the US and the EU is not purely based on productivity. In fact, productivity has been closely matched in the past, but it also highlights that the recent lack of productivity growth in Europe is quite concerning, while also highlighting that there are some upsides to the European economy, most notably more leisure time for workers. Okay, so this was a lot, but where does this actually leave us? Well, summarizing, the EU is falling behind, and this looks especially bad if you look at specific sectors like tech. However, the situation isn't as bleak as the GDP comparison would have you believe. Comparisons, like the one from Ambassador Putzler about Germany having a similar GDP to West Virginia, are probably quite misleading, and the economic performance of Germany is most definitely not comparable to West Virginia. Higher working hours and a much higher cost of living in the US really distort this naive comparison and makes using nominal GDP kind of useless for cases like this. We also have to remember that the EU is economically really diverse. The US as a country has basically been unchanged for the last 100 years, whereas Europe went through multiple pretty devastating wars, and large parts of Eastern Europe have been part of the Soviet Union or the Eastern Bloc up until 35 years ago. Even Germany has only been in its current state since then, and you still see massive discrepancies between East and West German. While 35 years might seem like a really long time, catching up from economic disadvantages like this can take generations. Overall, these developments are still really concerning though, and the EU really needs to address them. Obviously, doing something about this isn't an easy task. We haven't even gotten into the reasons why the EU might be lagging behind, and this topic is probably even more complicated than measuring them, so if I do it, it will be its own video. Anyway, if you made it to this point in the video, then I really hope you enjoyed it and that you learned something. If you have any questions or other input, or you thought I got something wrong, then please let me know in the comments. I would also be really interested to know which country you guys are from and whether or not you subjectively feel like you're missing out compared to the US or maybe Europe if you're from the US. Anyway, that's it for this one. See you in the next video.